The silence was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a physical thing, a crushing weight that pressed down on my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. It was heavier than the exhaustion that clung to me like a shroud, deeper than the lingering ache in my bones. It was the sound of a dream dying, and I stood in the doorway of the nursery, my hand still on the light switch, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The room was bathed in the soft golden glow of a dozen tiny nightlights, each one a star in our private galaxy. And in their cribs, arranged like perfect petals of a flower, were our 8 daughters. NFOR, the first time since they had come home from the hospital, all 8 of them were awake, and all 8 of them were smiling. NNOT, the fleeting gas pain twitches of newborns, but real, soul-deep smiles. Their eyes, 80 tiny windows to their brand-new souls, were fixed on the colorful mobile I had spent weeks crafting. It was a kaleidoscope of felt animals and shimmering ribbons, and as it spun lazily in the gentle current of the heater, it had captivated them. 8 tiny, perfect smiles, all at once, a silent chorus of pure, unadulterated joy. And it was a miracle, a moment so perfect, so sacred, it felt like the universe had paused just for us. NMY breath caught in my throat. Tears of pure, overwhelming love pricked at my eyes. I had to share this. He had to see this. "David," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. "David, you have to see this." Quickly, NHE was in the living room, just a few feet away. I had heard him come home from work, the familiar sound of his keys hitting the wooden bowl by the door. He hadn't said hello. He rarely did anymore. NHE appeared in the hallway behind me, a tall, dark silhouette against the brighter light of the living room. He didn't step into the nursery, just leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. "Look," I breathed, turning my tear-streaked face to him, my own smile so wide it hurt my cheeks. "Look, David, they're smiling, all of them, at the same time. Isn't it the most beautiful thing you've ever seen?" And I waited for his gasp, for his arm to wrap around my shoulders, for him to share in this perfect, impossible moment. NBUT, all I got was the silence. NHE looked over my shoulder, his gaze sweeping across the 8 cribs. His eyes, the same eyes I had fallen in love with, the ones I once thought held entire universes of kindness, were flat, empty, cold as polished stone. He looked at the 8 miracles I had brought into the world, the 8 daughters who carried his blood and his name, and his face remained a perfect, unreadable mask. NHE didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just looked. Then his eyes shifted and met mine in the dim light, and in that single, frozen moment, I saw it. Not anger, not disappointment, not even sadness. What I saw was worse. I saw nothing, a complete and total absence of feeling. It was as if he was looking at a painting in a museum he had no interest in, a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. NHE held my gaze for a heart-stopping second, the silence stretching into an eternity. Then, without a single word, he turned and walked back into the living room. I heard the distinct click of the television turning on, followed by the low murmur of a sports commentator. NHE had seen the miracle, and he had felt nothing, NTHE joy in my chest, so vibrant and overwhelming just moments before, shattered. It didn't just fade, it imploded, leaving behind a black hole of cold, gut-wrenching despair. The tears that had been tears of love now fell as scalding drops of agony. My smile faltered and collapsed. He hadn't just ignored the moment, he had murdered it. He had taken the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed and smothered it with his suffocating, soul-crushing silence. And in that moment, standing in the golden glow of the nursery, with the sound of my 8 daughters, silent joy behind me, and the drone of the television in front of me, I understood. The man I had married was gone. In his place was a stranger, a ghost who haunted the halls of our home. And his silence wasn't just a mood. It was a weapon, and he was using it to break me, piece by painful piece. NIF, your heart is already aching. Please don't turn away. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because you need to know how a woman fights back when her spirit is under siege. This is the story of how I learned to find my own voice in the deafening silence. NN. David wasn't always a man of silence. When I met him, his voice was my favorite sound. He was a music teacher at the local high school, a man whose passion for melody was infectious. I was a florist, working in my family's small shop downtown. He came in one day to buy a bouquet for the school's retiring principal, and we talked for over an hour about the emotional language of flowers and the narrative power of a symphony. NHE had a voice that was rich and warm, like cello strings. He used it to laugh, a booming, genuine sound that made everyone around him smile. He used it to explain complex musical theory with a patience that was mesmerizing. He used it to whisper promises to me under starry skies, promises of a life filled with harmony, laughter, and a house overflowing with the music of children. "I want a big family, Anna," he'd told me on our third date, his eyes shining with sincerity. "I want our home to be a beautiful chaos, the sound of little feet on the floorboards, the sound of laughter in every room, a symphony of our own." It was everything I wanted. I had grown up an only child in a house that was too quiet, and the future he painted was a masterpiece I desperately wanted to live in. Our wedding was a testament to his love for sound. He composed a piece of music for me to walk down the aisle to, a melody so beautiful and full of hope that it brought the entire church to tears. Our vows were not just spoken, they were sung, a duet of devotion that echoed off the high ceilings. NMY parents who had worried about my quiet nature adored him. "He brings you to life, sweetheart," my mother had said, her eyes misty. "He fills your silences with music." And he did. For the first few years, our life was a perfect composition. He would come home from school, and our small apartment would fill with the sound of him playing the piano, the notes weaving through the air as I arranged flowers for the next day. He was attentive, loving, and present. His voice was the constant, reassuring rhythm of my life. NTHE, first discordant note, came when we started trying for a family. It took longer than we expected. Month after month of negative pregnancy tests began to change the music of our home. The piano was played less frequently. David's laughter became a rarer melody. A new sound began to creep in, the sound of his quiet frustration. NHE became obsessed with control. He downloaded apps to track my cycle, took my temperature every morning with a clinical precision, and dictated our diets based on articles he'd read online. The spontaneity and joy were replaced by a rigid, demanding schedule. Our love life, once a passionate symphony, became a mechanical, goal-oriented performance. When I finally became pregnant, the relief was so immense it was almost painful. The music returned to our house, but it was different now. It was less joyful, more expectant. David's conversations all centered on one theme, a son, and a boy to carry on the family name. He'd say, a strange, almost desperate light in his eyes, "I'll teach him the violin. We'll have a string duo." And I'd gently remind him, "It could be a girl, you know, a little ballerina." "No," he'd say, his voice losing its warmth. "It'll be a boy." I can feel it. NTHE day of the ultrasound was the day the music truly began to die. The technician, a kind woman with a gentle smile, moved the wand over my belly. Her smile slowly faded, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. She called in the doctor. NMY heart hammered against my ribs. "Is something wrong?" I asked, my voice a thin whisper. NTHE doctor, a man with a calm demeanor, looked from the screen to me, then back again. He was silent for a long time. "Mrs. Evans," he said finally, his voice full of awe, "everything is not wrong. Everything is abundant. You're pregnant with octuplets." Nate. The number was so impossible, so fantastical, that I laughed. Then I saw the look on his face and realized he was serious. 8 babies. My mind reeled, a chaotic jumble of fear and wonder, NBUT. Then the doctor delivered the final fateful line. And from what we can see of the early chromosomal indicators, they all appear to be female. 8 daughters. My first thought was not of the logistics, the cost, or the health risks. My first thought was David. This would break him. His singular, obsessive dream of a son wasn't just unfulfilled. It was shattered into 8 tiny female pieces. And I knew, in that sterile, quiet room, that the symphony he had promised me was over. And I was terrified of the silence that was about to take its place. In telling David was the hardest thing I had ever done. I chose to do it at home, in the living room that had once been filled with so much music. I tried to frame it as a miracle, a blessing of impossible proportions. David, I started, my hands trembling. We're having babies. Plural. A slow smile spread across his face. Twins? That's amazing, Anna. More than twins, I said, my voice barely audible. The doctor, he said there are 8. NHI's smile vanished. His face went blank. 8? That's not possible. That's a freak show. It's a miracle, I insisted, my voice pleading. And David, they're girls, all of them. 8 beautiful, healthy little girls. NHE stared at me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the sound of his dreams crashing and burning. It was full of shock, disbelief, and a cold, rising tide of something that looked terrifyingly like resentment. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He just stood up, walked into our bedroom, and closed the door. He didn't speak to me again for 3 days. NTHAT was the beginning of the silence. It started as a punishment, a tool he used to express his profound disappointment. But it quickly evolved into his new language, his default state of being. The man whose voice had been my favorite sound now communicated almost exclusively through its absence. NTHE pregnancy was, to put it mildly, a media sensation. The octomom of Oak Creek. Our small town was buzzing. Donations poured in. The local news station wanted interviews. David played the part of the doting, overwhelmed but happy father-to-be. He would smile for the cameras, his arm around my ever-expanding waist, and speak in carefully chosen sound bites about what a blessing it all was. In BUT, the moment the cameras were off, the mask would drop, and the silence would descend again. He would retreat into a study, the door closed, no music playing. He stopped touching me. The man who once couldn't keep his hands off me now flinched if my arm brushed against his in the hallway. I was a walking, breathing monument to his failure, and he couldn't bear to be near me, and I was put on mandatory bed rest for the last 3 months of the pregnancy. My world shrank to the 4 walls of our bedroom. My only companions were the 8 tiny lives kicking and squirming inside me, and the suffocating silence of my husband. He would bring me meals on a tray, setting them down on the bedside table without a word, his eyes fixed on the wall behind my head. He never asked how I was feeling. He never touched my belly. NMY, friends and family tried to fill the void. My mother would visit every day, her face a mask of forced cheerfulness that couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. He's just scared, Anna, she'd say. It's a lot to process for any man, NBUT. I knew it was more than fear. It was a deep, profound rejection. He wasn't just rejecting the idea of 8 daughters. He was rejecting me for creating them. NTHE birth itself was a medical marvel, a carefully orchestrated event involving a team of dozens of doctors and nurses. The girls were born via C-section, one after another, their tiny, premature cries filling the operating room. They were whisked away to the NICU before I even had a chance to hold one. David was in the room, dressed in scrubs, standing in a corner as instructed. I remember looking over at him through the haze of anesthesia, hoping to see a flicker of awe, of love, of something. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. When the last baby was born and the doctor announced, Congratulations, you have 8 healthy daughters." He didn't move. He just gave a curt, single nod, turned, and walked out of the operating room. He didn't come to see me in the recovery room. He didn't visit me in my hospital room that night. NTHE. Next day, a nurse came in with a long face. "Mr. Evans has checked out," she said gently. "He left a note for you." NMY hands shook as I opened the folded piece of paper. It wasn't a letter, it was a list. A cold, practical list of instructions about hospital bills, insurance contacts, and the name of a lawyer he had retained. At the bottom, he had written a single sentence: "I cannot do this." NHE hadn't just walked out of the hospital, he had walked out of our lives. He had abandoned me with 8 premature babies and a list of phone numbers. The silence was no longer just in our home. It was a gaping chasm that had swallowed my entire life. Coming home from the hospital was the loneliest journey of my life. My mother drove me, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, a furious, protective silence radiating from her. The house felt cavernous and cold. All of David's things were gone. His clothes from the closet, his sheet music from the piano, his toothbrush from the bathroom. He had erased himself from our home with a chilling efficiency. NTHE, only thing he'd left behind was the silence. It was in every room, a constant, mocking reminder of his absence. NTHE first few weeks are a blur of exhaustion and terror. The girls were still in the NICU, an hour's drive away. Every morning, my mother would drive me to the hospital, where I would spend 12 hours sitting by their incubators, my life governed by the beeping of machines. I would pump breast milk every 2 hours, a painful, lonely ritual in a sterile little room. I would sing to them the melodies David had taught me, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the quiet of the neonatal ward. And I was a mother to 8 children I couldn't hold, living in a house that no longer felt like a home, abandoned by the man who had promised me a symphony. NTHE media frenzy was a nightmare. Reporters camped out on my lawn. The story had changed from a local human interest piece to a national scandal. Music teacher abandons octuplet mom. David had disappeared, his lawyer releasing a statement citing, quote, "extreme emotional and psychological distress." The statement subtly blamed me, hinting that my insistence on carrying all 8 babies to term had put an unbearable strain on the marriage. NTHE town that had once celebrated us now whispered about us. I was a tragic figure to some, a reckless fool to others. David's colleagues at the school defended him, talking about what a quote, sensitive, artistic soul he was, how this would have been too much for anyone. They were painting his abandonment as a symptom of his artistic temperament, a justifiable retreat from an overwhelming reality, and I felt like I was drowning. The financial strain was immense. The medical bills were astronomical. The donations that had poured in were frozen in a joint account that David's lawyer now controlled. I was alone, broke, and responsible for 8 fragile human lives. And one night, after a particularly grueling day at the hospital where one of the girls, little Clara, had a breathing scare, I came home to the empty, silent house, and I completely fell apart. I sank to the floor in the nursery we had designed together, surrounded by 8 empty cribs, and I sobbed. It was a raw, guttural sound of a creature in unbearable pain. I cried for my tiny, fighting daughters. I cried for my shattered dreams. And I cried for the man I had loved, the man who had been replaced by this cold, silent stranger. In the depths of that despair, something shifted. As my sobs subsided into ragged breaths, a new feeling began to rise from the ashes of my grief, anger. A cold, clear, clarifying anger. NHOW, dare he? How dare he paint himself as the victim? How dare he abandon his own children and then blame me for their existence? How dare he fill my life with promises of music and then leave me in this crushing, unbearable silence? And I stood up, my legs shaky but my resolve hardening. I walked over to the piano, the lid closed and covered in a thin layer of dust. I lifted the lid. For a moment, I just looked at the keys, the black and white notes that had once been the source of so much joy. Then, with a surge of fury, I slammed my hands down on the keyboard, creating a jarring, dissonant chord that ripped through the silence of the house. It was an ugly sound, a sound of pain and rage. And it was the first note in my new symphony. A symphony of survival time. NMY anger became my fuel. The next morning, I called a legal aid society. I was assigned a lawyer, a young, sharp woman named Maria, who seemed to run on coffee and righteous indignation. When I told her my story, her eyes lit up with a fierce protective fire. "No, he has no idea who he's messing with," she said, a grim smile on her face. "He thinks he can just walk away? Not on my watch." Maria was a force of nature. She filed emergency motions, fought for child support, and battled David's high-priced lawyer for every single penny. She taught me that the law could be an instrument, and we were going to use it to demand justice. While Maria fought for me in the courtroom, I fought for my daughters in the hospital. One by one, like a fragile but determined orchestra, they grew stronger. First Lily, then Rose, then Iris, then Daisy, then Violet, then Poppy, then Clara, and finally, tiny, tenacious Holly. They were all named after flowers from my shop, symbols of beauty and resilience. Bringing them home was a logistical and emotional whirlwind. My mother moved in with me, a godsend of unwavering support. Our house, once so silent, was now filled with the sounds of life, crying, cooing, and the constant hum of bottle warmers and sterilizers. It was chaotic, exhausting, and utterly beautiful. NTHE community, seeing me fight instead of crumble, began to rally around me in a new way. The whispers of judgment were replaced by offers of help. Women from my mother's church organized a meal train. The local hardware store owner showed up one day and installed new, safer locks on all my doors for free. Teenagers from the high school where David used to teach started a fundraising campaign, ashamed of their former teacher's actions. They organized a quote for the Evans girls, raising thousands of dollars to help with our expenses. And it was a slow, painstaking process of rebuilding. I learned to live on 4 hours of sleep. I learned to change a diaper in 30 seconds. I learned to comfort a crying baby with one arm while feeding another with the other. I learned that my own capacity for love was infinitely deeper and stronger than I had ever imagined, and I started to find my own voice again, not just in singing to my babies, but in advocating for them. I gave one interview, and one interview only, to a national magazine. I didn't badmouth David. I didn't play the victim. I simply told my truth. I spoke about the joy my daughters brought me, about the strength I found in their tiny, grasping hands, and about the incredible kindness of the community that had stepped up when my husband stepped out. NTHE article was a turning point. It reframed the narrative. I was no longer the abandoned wife. I was the resilient mother. And one evening, after all 8 girls were finally asleep, I sat at the piano. My fingers hovered over the keys. I thought about the piece David had composed for our wedding, a melody that now felt like it belonged to another lifetime. NS, lowly, hesitantly, I began to play. It wasn't one of his complex symphonies. It was a simple lullaby, a melody that was all my own. It was a quiet song, but it was not a song of silence. It was a song of hope, of survival, of a love that had been tested and had not only endured, but had multiplied by 8 years past. The cacophony of infancy softened into the lively chatter of childhood. My house was a whirlwind of scraped knees, finger paintings, and 8 distinct, vibrant personalities. Lily was the quiet, observant leader. Rose was the dramatic artist. Iris was the bookworm. Daisy the daredevil. Violet was the peacemaker. Poppy the comedian. Clara the nurturer. And Holly, my littlest fighter, was the most stubborn and determined of them all. They were my world, my everything. and I had built a life for us, a fortress of love and routine, brick by brick. I reopened my family's flower shop, bringing the girls with me in a giant, custom-made playpen that sat in the back room. They grew up surrounded by the scent of earth and blossoms. My life was not easy, but it was full. The silence David had left behind had been filled with so much laughter, so much life, that I had almost forgotten what it sounded like. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, the silence returned. NHE was just there, standing in the doorway of my flower shop, a place he had not set foot in for nearly 6 years. NHE looked different, older, thinner. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out look in his eyes. He was holding a single, sad-looking rose. NMY heart didn't leap. It didn't ache. It just went cold. I put down the watering can I was holding and stood up straight, placing myself between him and the sound of my daughters playing in the back. "David," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Nana," he said, and the sound of his voice, once my favorite melody, was now a jarring, unwelcome noise. "You look good. What do you want?" I asked, my tone leaving no room for pleasantries. NHE took a hesitant step into the shop. I made a mistake," he stammered, his eyes darting around the familiar space. "A terrible, unforgivable mistake. I was lost. I was scared. I wasn't myself." He was reciting a speech, one he had likely practiced in front of a mirror. It was a performance, and I was not an appreciative audience. "You weren't scared, David," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You were disappointed. You ordered a son, and the universe delivered 8 daughters. So you refused the shipment." NHE flinched as if I had slapped him. "It wasn't like that. I've been in therapy. I've done the work. I understand now. My issues with my father, my own insecurities." NHE kept talking, his voice weaving a narrative of victimhood and redemption. He had lost his job, his reputation. He had been living in another state, working menial jobs. He had hit rock bottom. And now, he was here to make amends. "And I want to know them, Anna," he said, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. He took another step closer. "They're my daughters. I have a right to know them." NTHE word, right, was a lit match in a room full of gasoline. Right? I repeated, my voice dropping to an icy whisper. "You have no rights here. You forfeited your rights the day you left me in a hospital bed with a list of phone numbers. You forfeited your rights when you let this community, my mother and complete strangers, raise your children while you were off, finding yourself. You don't have rights, David. You have audacity." From the back room, I heard a burst of laughter. It was Poppy, telling a silly joke. David's eyes flickered towards the sound, a flicker of something. Curiosity? Longing? It didn't matter. "Just let me see them," he pleaded, his composure finally cracking. "Just for a minute." "No," I said. The word was absolute. It was a steel door slamming shut. "The life you abandoned is not waiting for you to return. The symphony you walked out on has continued without you. We don't need a new conductor, especially not one who dropped the baton and ran at the first difficult passage. Now get out of my shop." NHE stared at me, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. He had expected tears, anger, maybe even a grudging acceptance. He had not expected this. This cold, unbreakable finality. NHE placed the single rose on the counter, a pathetic, wilted offering, and turned and walked away. I watched him go, my heart beating a steady, strong rhythm. I was not the broken, silent woman he had left behind. I was a fortress, and he was no longer welcome inside the walls. Now NHI's retreat was not a surrender. It was a tactical withdrawal. A week later, I was served with papers. David was suing for parental rights. Visitation, at first. Then, joint custody. NHI's lawyer, the same expensive suit from years ago, argued that David had recovered from the psychological break that had caused his temporary absence. He had a steady job now, in a neighboring town. He had an apartment with a spare bedroom. He had, according to a hired psychiatrist, processed his initial trauma and was now ready and eager to be a father. NTHE legal battle was a brutal, draining ordeal. It was a war fought not with weapons, but with depositions, motions, and character assassinations. David's legal team tried to paint me as a bitter, vindictive woman who was poisoning his children against him. They used my initial interview, the one where I had spoken of my resilience, as evidence of my unwillingness to co-parent. They forced the girls, now 7 years old, into court-mandated therapy sessions with a court-appointed evaluator. They were asked questions no child should ever have to answer. How do you feel about your father? Do you want to see him? Does your mother talk about him? NMY daughters were confused and scared. They had only ever known a life with me, my mother, and our tight-knit community. This strange man, this ghost from a past they couldn't remember, was a source of anxiety and disruption. "Why does he want to see us now, Mommy?" Lily asked me one night, her brow furrowed with a worry that was too old for her years. "If he didn't want us when we were babies, why does he want us now?" And I answered her as honestly as I could. "I don't know, sweetheart, but you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Your feelings are what matter most." NTHE day of the custody hearing was gray and cold. David sat across the courtroom, looking earnest and repentant. He gave a tearful, polished testimony about his regret and his deep, abiding love for the children he had never met. He spoke of his desire to teach them music, to share his life with them. And when it was my turn, I didn't speak of my anger or my pain. I spoke of the reality of the last 7 years. I presented evidence of every doctor's appointment he had missed, every birthday he had ignored, every school play he had been absent for. I presented the thousands of dollars in unpaid child support. I presented the testimony of teachers, neighbors, and friends who had witnessed my struggle and my children's happy, stable lives. NMY's final piece of evidence was a series of drawings, one from each of my daughters. The evaluator had asked them to draw their family, 8 drawings. And in every single one, there were 3 figures: me, their grandmother, and their 7 sisters. In some, there were friends or pets. But in not a single one was there a father. "Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and steady, "a family is not just about blood. It's about presence. It's about showing up. It's about putting scraped knees before your own pride. It's about holding a hand during a nightmare. It's about being there." David Evans was not there. He chose not to be. And while he may be ready to be a father now, the job of father to these 8 little girls is not a vacancy that has been held open for him. It is a role that has been filled every single day for 7 years by a community, by a grandmother, and by me. To insert him into their lives now would not be a gift. It would be a trauma. NTHE judge, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, listened to everything. She looked at David, at his lawyer, at the pile of evidence, and at the 8 crayon drawings. NSHE took a deep breath. "Mr. Evans," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument, "parenthood is a verb. It is an action. It is not a right you can store in a drawer and take out when it is convenient for you. Your absence has been total and absolute. And while you may have found yourself, you have, in the process, lost your children. Petition for visitation and custody is denied." Emphatically, NTHE gavel came down with a sharp, final crack. It was the sound of a door being locked for good. The sound of a final, unforgiving cadence. NTHE courtroom victory was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of profound, weary relief. It was the end of a long, discordant chapter. Now, the music could finally be ours again, uninterrupted. Life settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. The girls thrived, secure in the knowledge that their world was safe. They grew into remarkable young women, each a unique and vibrant note in our family's symphony. Lily, my quiet leader, won a scholarship to a prestigious university to study architecture. Rose, my artist, had her paintings displayed in a local gallery. Daisy, my daredevil, became a certified EMT, saving lives. One by one, they found their own melodies, their own passions. And I continued to run the flower shop, a place of peace and beauty. My mother, my steadfast partner through it all, enjoyed her golden years, surrounded by the boisterous love of her 8 granddaughters. Our house was never quiet. It was a constant, beautiful chaos of laughter, arguments over who used the last of the milk, and the sound of 8 different playlists clashing and combining. It was the symphony David had once promised me, but it was a symphony we had composed ourselves. I never heard from David again. I heard through the grapevine that he moved away, to another state, another life. He became what he had always been to my daughters, a ghost, a story, a biological fact as relevant to their daily lives as the name of a distant star. He was a silence that no longer had any power. One warm summer evening, I was sitting on the back porch, watching my now teenage daughters teach my mother a new dance they had learned online. They were a whirlwind of long limbs and laughter, their faces bright with joy. And Clara, my gentle nurturer who now volunteered at the animal shelter, came and sat beside me. She leaned her head on my shoulder. "Mom," she said quietly, "I saw a picture of him the other day, online. Someone had tagged him in an old photo from the school." And I tensed for a moment, my old defensive instincts kicking in. "Oh?" "He looked sad," she said, "and small." I thought I would feel angry, but I didn't. I just felt nothing. She looked up at me. Her eyes, so like his in color but so different in warmth, were full of a calm wisdom. He missed all of this, didn't he? He missed everything. And I looked out at the beautiful, chaotic, loving scene in my backyard. I saw Lily patiently explaining a dance move, Poppy doing a silly imitation, and the pure, unadulterated love that flowed between them all. "Yes, sweetie," I said, my heart swelling with a love so vast it felt like it could power the sun. "He missed everything.